It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have a hodgepodge episode where we are going to cover some Vince McMahon, WWE things. We're going to talk about the antitrust lawsuit a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia as well. But first, John, how are you?
Honestly, not great. We got a lot of rain out here in sunny Los Angeles is nonstop rain. I got leaks in my roof. I got the plaster coming down, and I got the cat. Isla's made herself a bed on me, so I cannot move. That's the rule. That's the rule of the household.
What Isla wants, Isla gets.
Yeah, I can't believe I agreed to this, but apparently that is true.
So, John, I thought it never rained in California.
They lied. That song is full of shit. You know, I want my money back. But no, every year we get several days to a couple of weeks of rain. Hopefully, now, people might not be aware of this, but historically, they've gone back to the record. Every 200 years, there is a massive rainfall in California.
Oh,
we're talking biblical. And the last one was during the Civil War. That's why it was kind of not known, because not many settlers were out here at the time. And, you know, the war was going on, but it was so bad. It created a lake in the middle of California. The entire Hollywood area was underwater, 3 feet of water. And not Hollywood, I said the entire LA basin was under 3 feet of water. The river changed direction. It was just an apocalyptic disaster. And so we are almost due. We are due coming up on that 200-year span.
Oh my. Well, hopefully you get your roof fixed and yourself situated. But for right now, let's look at the scandal with Vince McMahon and the WWE. And my first question is, how much culpability do you think TKO Holdings, Ari Emanuel, that whole group have in this Vince McMahon scandal? Because they had to have known something, right? The deal was cut after Vince had all these sexual harassment scandals already hanging over his head. So tell me your take on this thing.
Well, I mean, they're not culpable in the crimes per se, because obviously those were done internally by the UFC, sorry, WWE. Vince is culpable for the actual crimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by all reports, they all happened before TKO, you know, was the merger happened. So I haven't heard of anything happening since then. But I mean, I was listening to Dave Meltzer, who's, you know, probably he follows pro wrestling a lot more than I do, and he's been on the ball on all this stuff for decades now. I mean, probably my entire life almost. And I'm an old guy, so that says a lot. He was talking about how Endeavor had to have known. Emanuel had to have known some details, maybe not all the details. He might have been caught off guard on some of the some of the nastiest accusations in the allegations in the complaint, but he had to know something happened, because he had to know about the settlements with various women. He had to know that the stories floating around. And they rep. If I'm not mistaken, his agency represents McMahon as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they go back. So the stories should have been there. Any sort of due diligence should have brought up, but they should have. It seems apparent. It's almost unbelievable that TKO had no idea that these allegations were floating around, that the settlements weren't paid off, that there's, you know, I mean, obviously, even the federal investigation that's underway now, they filed subpoena. They had a subpoena. They had to know about all this stuff. So there is, I guess the culpability is, there was an article or someone was anonymously quoted as, he would not want this to, he would have been happy if this never came out, him being Emanuel. And that's what it sounds like. As long as business is going fine, they were hoping that this would be that the settlements would have been the end of it, and this would have been a done deal. So culpability to the for the crime, none probably, but to the stockholders, to the company and everything, he probably holds a lot of culpability.
Since Janel Grant according to her attorney, isn't looking for a settlement. What she's looking for is to, and I quote, change the toxic culture at WWE. Do you think there could be some sort of blowback onto the UFC throughout all of this? Or is that me just going a little too far out there in left field?
Well, I mean, there's potentially some blowback in the sense that TKO and is WWE and UFC. They're a joint entity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one, they have a joint stock, right? So if there's a blowback based on this, that would affect the stock price of the company, which affects UFC's valuation. That's one potential thing. The other potential thing is the brand image could take a hit because it could be tainted by being connected to WWE. I guess the big thing is what else comes out in the complaint, and if she doesn't want to settle, it goes to trial. What comes out and what's the end result? Because if this is a trial and more people come forward having terrible stories, if the WWE becomes just well known as basically just a criminal enterprise on top of being a pro wrestling promotion, that's a terrible look, and it's terrible to be in business with them. So that could come back to haunt them. There also is a possibility that UFC's there have been, I mean, I got to be clear, first of all, nothing even remotely as egregious as what Vince McMahon's been accused of are the stories. But there are stories of behavior and rumors of behavior by top people at the UFC that are salacious, that are scandalous, that types of that are unbecoming of an executive. Those type of rumors, do those rumors get picked up again? Do people start looking closely into the UFC and airing all their dirty laundry because of the WWE? That's a potential possibility too.
Oh, yes. And then Dana's assault on his wife last year could also come into play again, all over again, right?
That could come into play. There could be looks at any other possible allegations of abuse. There's, he was blackmailed.
Oh, yes.
Remember that? There's that. So would that be reinvestigated, re-examined potentially under a different light? All that's possible. So, it's possible based on the view of it might also be people's view of it might change certain events of the UFC based on the presumption based on what the WWE has been doing.
Now, with her not looking for a settlement and looking to change the toxic culture at WWE, I want to ask you an oddball question. So in the antitrust lawsuit, the plaintiffs kind of want injunctive relief to be on the table. Now, I know injunctive relief can't happen here, but what could she be looking for if not a settlement? How would this lawsuit be able to change the toxic culture at WWE?
Well, it sounds like, my guess would be a settlement. Usually when you settle it, it closes the case. There's no further discovery, no revelations, no trial. If there's not a settlement, that means a lot more information, dirty laundry and stuff would be publicly aired, right? And potentially, and if there's not a settlement, she could be going up for the maximum amount of damages. On top of that, too, with the settlement, she might also be, not waiving criminal charges. She'll take part in a criminal trial. So criminal charges could still be on the table with her as pressing charges or being a witness in that. So all that's on the table. So it's a lot more, I guess, the potential outcome. Yeah, it's not an injunctive relief where the UFC fighters are asking for a change of behavior being like the contracts, because I can't imagine there's contracts involved, although it could say you got to get rid of all your NDAs. I'm sure that's a possibility. The judge says these NDAs are, they're unenforceable. We're gonna throw out all of them, and so more people could come forward. That's a possibility. But really the possibility is just much more the public goes light. There's much more shaming of people at WWE, much more possibility that people get criminal charges potentially filed against them. And then again, the damages might be a lot higher.
Do you think that lawsuits will eventually be filed by TKO board members?
It's possible. I wouldn't say board member. I think shareholders would be more likely.
Excuse me. Yes, that's the one I'm going for. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah.
I just used the wrong term.
I'm sure someone's drafting up a complaint right now for the shareholders. So that's possible. Could they win? I don't know. But if people at the board, if there was a lot more known and this ends up hurting the stock, then there would be a case, because it's like you hid this information, you merged with a company that had this incredibly risky, is a risky merger based on the possible complaint that was coming down the pipe and that you knew about. All that would make them ripe for a lawsuit. Now the question is, though, will they be hurt by this complaint? That's the big question. If the complaint doesn't hurt them and there's, the stock price rebounds and the fan base and public doesn't seem to care, then it's going to be hard to win a suit on that. But if this complaint has legs and they win damages and it hurts the stock and the brand drops, then shareholders would definitely have I think they would have a case to make.
And since we're here talking about the WWE and shareholders and board members and TKO Holdings and all of that, can you explain what Dwayne Johnson's new role at TKO Holdings is?
I don't know. Just a figurehead, I guess. He's there. I mean, that's what it sounds like. He's there to be a figurehead, to be the face, to do PR, public relation, media events. Use his brand. He's the new Arnold Schwarzenegger. So this is kind of like if they had hired Arnold Schwarzenegger in the late 80s, right? Early 90s when he's at his peak. So that, and in exchange, Dwayne gets $30 million in stock, which is a tremendous amount for a board member, because usually it doesn't work that way. And he also gets his brand name back, which is incredibly valuable to him. It's kind of interesting is The Rock is really seems very adept at putting himself in the right place to cash in on stuff, even though, again, I'm marveling at his ability to do this. I don't know if he's like a financial genius per se, but he very much seems to understand the winds blow and where to put himself in a position to take advantage of it. I mean, you've got to imagine that based on the reading of the complaint articles and what Meltzer and other people say, that this might spread to more executives at WWE, right? That the WWE, the top of the whole promotion, might have to go. They might have to clean the slate and get rid of all these people. In which case, who is in a prime position who's been outside the WWE that has nothing to do with this to step in and be the new head of the WWE? The Rock, Dwayne Johnson.
It wouldn't be a Triple H?
Triple H, he was there during the whole time that this was going on, right?
Yeah.
He is apparently, it looks like he's hinted at as an unnamed person in the complaint.
Right.
His response has been terrible from what I understand the press conferences. It's possible that his future, he could be one of the people put on I'm just spitballing here, but I don't think it's impossible to imagine that his head might be one of the ones put on the chopping block.
Wow. All right. So we mentioned the antitrust suit. I'm going to go ahead and steer us in that direction right now. And my first question is, we had all of these text messages that were revealed upon diving through the latest batch of discovery documents. And so when we see these text messages, how much weight do they carry in this?
Well, not a lot, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
The fans seem to get very excited about it. But in the case, the case isn't built on these text messages. What they're there for is to reinforce the narrative that the plaintiffs have.
Okay.
They want to give an example that the UFC has this extra contractual power to hold fights from people, to get them to re-sign, stuff like that. It has leverage to, or that they have a tiered system of payments, that it's already prearranged what people are going to be paid. It's not negotiated. And they use these text messages and emails to kind of reinforce that this is what the UFC does. So on that, it's good evidence for the plaintiffs when presented as part of a narrative to show, here's an example of what we're talking about, what the UFC did. A good example, I think a really strong piece of evidence, and this is an email that I think is a really strong piece of evidence, is Joe Silva saying, "We own MMA." Now, on its own, that doesn't mean much. He could be bragging, but included in the email was the old SB Nation's consensus rankings, the bloody elbow, the best consensus rankings ever in MMA. We should bring them back. Side note, but the old consensus rankings, he included that in the email. And you look at it, and this was right about the time that the UFC was buying Strikeforce. The UFC, you go through that email and you see the UFC has 70% of the top 10, 15 fighters. And then when you include Strikeforce, you're suddenly up to 90, 95%. So that we own MMA comment kind of takes on a whole new meaning when you see that they actually do own all the top rated fighters. And so something like that I think would be very good evidence to highlight that the UFC knew what they were doing while talking about this stuff that sounds like they are attempting to control the sport itself.
With the WWE scandal being this whole big, bad, new problem, is there a greater chance for a settlement now?
I still think it's strange, because I used to say that I think there'd be a settlement in the UFC case, right? I used to think it's guaranteed because the risk is too high. But in many ways, because the case is dragged out so long, the risk of settlement, I think, is the idea of settlement has gone away, and it seems much more likely they're going to go to trial. And the reason I come to that conclusion is that before the UFC, when the trial was first launched, the UFC's revenue was about $600 million and their EBITDA was about $180 million. So you're talking potential damages from $800 to $1.6 billion, then trebled to 2.4 to 4.8. That was unaffordable to the UFC. That was an existential crisis if that had happened. There'd be no way for the UFC to cover those costs. They would be like, we cannot pay that. We have to sell the asset of the UFC. That's the only way we could pay it. Now, since they got that ESPN deal, though, their revenue has skyrocketed, and especially their profits and EBITDA have skyrocketed. So if they lose if they lose a tremendous amount to the fighters, they could probably take out a loan and pay the interest on the loan. Now, it would hurt their stock price somewhat, and it would cut into their profits. But their profits are so vast now, it wouldn't cut in that much. So, an example, let's say the plaintiffs win the case and get awarded $1 billion in damages. It's trebled to $3 billion. Well, there's a potential that they could then settle and negotiate it lower, because they'd say, listen, we're not going to appeal it if you lower it. But let's say they don't. $3 billion, you take a loan out. That's basically matches the debt they have right now, the UFC, at $2.8 billion. The loan on that, so it would double their interest payment on their loan. Well, that means that instead of $400 million in revenue profits right now, they get $250 million in profits right now. And that's only going to go up in the next few years after they sign the next TV deal. So there's that. And then on top of that, there's no injunctive relief in this case right now. Injunctive relief has been moved to the next case. And injunctive relief was the big risk to their business plan, their business model. And so without injunctive relief, there's no threat that profit margin is going to be hurt at all.
Okay, but this scandal doesn't hurt any of that, though? Doesn't hurt any? I mean, do they possibly look at the future and think that maybe their stock prices are going to plummet or whatever?
Well, it could potentially hurt their stock price if they lost the case, but I don't think the scandal doesn't play into the case, because they're not going to present evidence of the scandal at all in the antitrust suit. So on that sense, it doesn't. I mean, it could have an impact on the stock, because just like this case could, because if you lose, one is, yes, it's going to impact your profit somewhat, because you do have to pay those damages. And two, people will just in their head think, oh, the UFC took a hit. And that might take that would also cost their stock.
That's where I was going. Yes, that part. What about a sale? Is with this scandal and possibly the stock price fallout, or any fallout that this could bring, in conjunction with a possible loss at trial, is there a higher potential for a sale?
I'm not sure about that, because Endeavor still owns 51%. And the big thing is the profit margins are still immense for the UFC and for TKO as a whole. So I don't think they're going to want to get rid of those profit margins. Now, I think in the long run, a sale is always a possibility, because they're willing to cash in. It's not like they're emotionally attached, have a deep connection to the UFC. They're there to make money. So I think personally, a sale is always on the table. But I think a sale is the idea that they have to sell would come in much more to play if they lose the antitrust suit, right? Then this case, the Lee case, then I think a sale potentially comes into more in play, or that they, sell more of the public to the public, the shares of the price, because the next case, Johnson, will be coming up, and that one will have injunctive relief on the table. And if you lose the Lee case, injunctive relief, first the Johnson case, something gets much stronger. It would be almost impossible to win it if you lose the Lee case. But because you won it and you have injunctive relief, the possibility of injunctive relief becomes almost, I would say, almost guaranteed it's going to happen at that point.
All right, so we're going to move now into Saudi Arabia. And I can't help but notice that I'm seeing a lot of Turki al-Sheikh. And most recently, he was a guest on a show. I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm not sure which one because it's just 11 seconds, but I think it might have been an interview with Ariel Helwani. But in the interest of fairness here, I don't know who it was with. It just sounded to me like it might have been Ariel because I heard a voice, but I'm not sure. I just saw this 11-second clip. But in the clip, he says that Gervonta Davis, he was talking to Gervonta, and that Gervonta told him, give me 2 Ferraris and I'll come play in Saudi Arabia. And Turki al-Sheikh says that he told Gervonta, I'll give you 2 gloves for you to come over and play in Saudi Arabia and nothing else. Like he was flexing, like he was beating on his chest a little bit. So my question here is that we're seeing a lot more of this guy. He's making a lot of media appearances. People are quoting him a lot more. He's very, very visible on social media. Has Saudi done enough sports washing to be able to integrate like that with the mainstream now?
Well, what's interesting, people might forget this, back when Khashoggi, the Saudi citizen, was killed when he visited the embassy in Turkey. He gave an interview that was posted after his death to Newsweek, and comments were posted. And he had mentioned that the Crown Prince does not have political advisors except for 2 people, 2 names he gave. One was Saud al-Qahtani. The other one was Turki al-Sheikh, the person we're talking about. And then he included this is him talking, not me, Saudi Arabia. So just make sure you're aware of that. This is Khashoggi talking, not John Nash, in case a flight ever gets rerouted to Riyadh or something. I got to be careful here. He quotes and says, of the three people, the prince and Turki and al-Qahtani, they are very thuggish. People fear them. You challenge them, you might end up in prison. So part of it could be an act, but the other thing, he could be signaling to people like, we are not pushovers with this money. We are, we're very demanding. And I think that's part of it. I think people have expected, and it might have been a play by the Saudis too, is people think of them as marks just handing money out for fights. And they might have done that originally because the idea is like almost like a drug dealer. Let's get them addicted to the idea of coming over here for the big bucks, but then start making demands. Oh, you need this money from us. We expect more and more from you.
Well, Gervonta Davis replied back, when have I ever needed him? And basically that signaled to me that he's the draw and he doesn't need them. But I want to read something to you that happened about 16 hours ago when the new Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk fight date was revealed. A whole other ball of wax happened. And that is that the organizers, basically Turki al-Sheikh and the prince, they have threatened a $10 million penalty if either Usyk or Fury pulls out of their new date in May. And there's another twist as well, and that is that Anthony Joshua will be a stand-in if... How does this work? Okay, it says... The undisputed heavyweight championship fight between Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk has been rescheduled to May 18th in Riyadh. Now, the organizers have said that the boxers will face a $10 million penalty if they withdraw, and that Anthony Joshua will be stepping in if such a scenario occurs. But there's a really weird deal with that. Joshua will only be paired up with Fury. and that if Usyk can choose his opponent if Fury withdraws again.
Well,
so
I think that's because Usyk beat Joshua twice. There's no interest in that fight, and also Usyk has an IBF mandatory.
Well, I'm more worried about the $10 million penalty, to be quite frank.
I got to be honest. I'm not that alarmed by that because in some ways, I want to get back first to Davis. That is true. He doesn't need Saudi Arabia, and I think that's one. There's a select few fighters that are such draws. Davis is one, Canelo the other one, that they can sell pay-per-views in North America, which is the most lucrative spot on the planet, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be hard at the amount that they can possibly sell here for the Saudis to match it. Now, I'm sure they could offer something that might appeal them enough to come over for, let's say, let's say there's a mandatory that one of them has to defend. Davis isn't really, worried about that as much. He's not fighting for the full titles, but Canelo is. He might have a bad, kind of like the Ryder fight, where as a mandatory, maybe he takes a Saudi fight that will cover his normal payments because just the opponent won't draw. But both of those guys, the big bucks, they're selling $600,000-$700,000. Well, we'll have to see what Davis does in the future. But I imagine $700,000-$800,000 buys. You're talking $40 million right there in revenue, plus big, the last two fights for both of them, both the $20 million gates. They're generating tremendous amount of money in North America. Now, for Fury and Usyk, the penalty would normally bug me, except this is almost a site. They're giving just a direct payment, they're paying the full amount, guaranteed money. And so it doesn't seem that shocking to me that they have a clause in it like we're going to penalize you if you can't make this date, especially after we've tried to set it several times in the past. Because if those fighters could make that money anywhere else, they would say, screw you. I'm not going to take a penalty. I'm just going to take this fight somewhere else.
All right. Is Saudi still only interested in heavyweight boxing, or are they looking at the lighter weight classes now? And again, I'm referencing that Gervonta Davis clip because Turki Al-Sheikh was already speaking to Gervonta. So that tells me that they were interested in making a fight somehow.
Well, there's been talk of them in a way. There's been talk with Haney. They've been talking to, I guess, McGregor versus Manny Pacquiao was just thrown out there. So I'm sure other spectacle big fights they want to have because they want to be known as the big fight spot. So I'm sure they're willing to do those. The heavyweights, though, I think their game plan is to own the heavyweight division.
Yeah.
That's their goal. And fighters, boxers better be careful because the Saudis are not dumb. And right now it seems it's all gravy for the fighters because just huge amounts of money. But if I do worry because they're going to start kind of having their own belt. And I'm sure a lot of fans will get excited if they can get rid of the four sanctioning organizations, just have one title for heavyweight. But you got to ask who controls that title. What are the contractual rights to it? Because right at first, the Saudis would just pay people to show up and fight once. Now they're asking for multi-fight deals. You don't know what's down the line, and fighters could find out them and future fighters could be in trouble if the Saudis work their way to basically become a UFC of MMA where they have the title becomes their title, and people get locked into contracts to compete for that title in Saudi Arabia.
I'm working my way back to the antitrust suit for one last question, but before we get there, I have one more question here. Now, since Saudi is pretty invested in the WWE, could there be blowback from the Saudis to WWE with all of this bullshit that's going on right now? And I'm thinking more along the lines of maybe not having the crown jewel events or canceling deals, or if there's any backdoor investments, maybe that comes to a halt. What could be blowback, if any at all, do you see?
Well, I could be stereotyping, but I don't see the Saudis being really that worked up over the allegations in the sense that they're worried that a foreign company has an executive that has these allegations against them. I do think, though, if the allegations start hurting the WWE to the point where the brand value is not as strong,
that's where I'm going with it.
And yeah, the audience, the attendance and viewership goes down and stuff, then they might be upset. Like, we are spending a lot of money, giving you a ton of money for what is no longer the premier event in pro wrestling that it used to be. Then they could be upset. I do not know what clauses they have. I'm sure. I would just be guessing. I got to be honest. I'd be guessing. So I don't know. But if they have a way out and the UFC, but the WWE takes a major hit, I would imagine that they would try to take advantage of it and end the contract and then go after, I guess, what's the other one? AEW. But I don't know. It might be a guaranteed contract for a number of years. So I don't follow pro wrestling enough to even have a clue what's going on that front.
You know, we were talking a second ago about the antitrust stuff, and I asked you if there was a higher potential for a UFC sale. Now, I'm just curious why the Saudis are investing hundreds of $millions here, there, and everywhere, especially in PFL, $100 million. That came before Francis signed with them. Now, why aren't they buying their own promotion? Why aren't they starting their own promotion? Obviously, because there's no fighters out there. So could they be, if there were ever a sale of the UFC, could they be a legit competitor to buy the UFC this time around? Because now they're much more front-facing. It seems like all the sports washing has begun to work. They are out there. So could we see maybe a UFC sale to Saudi if it were to ever happen? We are very much spitballing well into the future here, but I just want to know.
Oh, no, I think that's always a possibility. I mean, to me, the stronger possibility, again, I'm just guessing, is the United Arab Emirates, some entity there, because the United Arab Emirates, even though they're close to the Saudis, they're also kind of a Gulf rival of theirs. They're incredibly wealthy as well. So if the UFC, because of the relationship they have forged with the UAE, I imagine that they would get first dibs at buying the UFC, right? In fact, because of that relationship, it seems like the UFC has been unable to go all in on the Saudi Arabian money that the other promotions and other entities have. They now have site fees and stuff, but they haven't been able to go all in because they've given contractual guarantees to have events in United Arab Emirates. So that would be my guess. But I think, I do think imagine a future, and this is just a guess, imagine a future the UFC loses the antitrust lawsuit, or the Ali Act gets put into place, right? Well, in that case, why not just hold events in Saudi Arabia and broadcast them there, or United Arab Emirates, where it's outside the legal jurisdiction of the United States for the Ali Act.
Wow. Boy, you just put a whole new nightmare in my head.
I mean, I don't think that would really conceivably work because the UFC is the United States is such a major market, would open the door for another competitor to work in the US market. But it's still, I mean, if the UFC is that valuable and let's say other territories become super valuable, the UFC is, more so than the United States, then I don't think it's inconceivable at that point.
Wow. Okay, and I have one final antitrust question. I mentioned that I was working my way back to it. There's some analysts out there, TD Cowen and Wolf Research, that have reported that the upcoming trial could impact the UFC's business model. Do you think that is true?
No, I don't. In fact, we had a discussion earlier. I answered on a different answer. I'd give the same answer I'm going to give now. I don't think it's going to affect their business model because, one, the damages, as big as they are, the UFC is too profitable. They'll be able to cover it down. That would hurt the damages of that sort when they have to take a big loan out and they have to pay interest every year, would hurt their stock price because their profits wouldn't be as high. But that wouldn't kill the business model. The only way to destroy the business model, or at least change it, is through the injunctive relief, change the contracts, but that's not on the table. So the business model is going to stay the same going forward, which means you don't have to worry about you don't have to worry about fighters having more leverage to ask for more money, and you don't have to worry about rival promotions suddenly getting a bunch of fighters that are unhappy with the UFC. The business, they'll have to pay the damages if they lose, but the business model stays the same and they will continue printing money going forward, that means.
Okay, now I've got a couple more questions. All right, with the Johnson case, let's say they lose the Lee case. the Johnson case, will it be held up the same way that this Lee case has been for X amount of years, or will it move much more expeditiously because they lost the Lee case? I just want to know if they're going to be able to stall the way they have with this one.
Well, I want to be clear. Are you talking about the defendants or the plaintiffs lose the Lee case?
The defendants, if they
UFC, if the UFC loses the case.
Yes.
No, I don't think they'll be able to slow it down as much, because unless another pandemic breaks out, let's knock on wood that doesn't happen. And unless there's another case like Oleana, the tuna case broke out, that interrupted, unless two things like that, the judge has made it clear he wants to go forward. He's given an outline. He has discovery going to start. He has all the things. So I think based on the timeline we have right now, 2027 would be the trial for the Johnson case.
Jesus Christ, that is far away.
Well, that's only 3 years.
That's far away.
You've got 2 years.
I know, but it's still, to me, it just seems.
Oh, that's a long ways, but that's, I mean, it's a whole nother case, but it's 2 years of discovery you got to do. We haven't even started discovery. So it would take a while to get the discovery, the reports, but I think compared to the 9 years, it was filed in 2021. So that means compared to this one, which is, on its 10th year, it would have been a 6-year span. It's almost twice as fast.
So actually, no, because it was already filed in 2021. That was 3 years ago. And then we've got to wait 3 more. That's 6 years already.
Yeah, that's why I said 6 years. And the other one's now on it's on its 10th year. It's coming up on.
Yeah, so this is
almost twice as fast.
No, this is more than twice as. Oh, yeah, you're right. Almost twice as fast. But anyways, I mean, come on, this is terrible.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not fair to the plaintiffs. It's not fair. I mean, it's not fair to the defendants either in some case, because you have this ongoing lawsuit. Although the UFC, I'm sure they're happy the longer this drags out. That's their goal, to drag it out as long as possible. But for plaintiffs, for fighters that actually, if we find that the fighters actually were damaged and deserve money, I mean, this is money that probably would have helped a lot of them much earlier, considering how much, physical injuries and other problems fighters we see have.
All right. Last question. And I can't believe I've never asked you this before, but it just occurred to me, and I figure other people might want to know this too. So we get to the Lee case, in April, and let's say they lose. The UFC loses. The next step, obviously, is to appeal that loss, correct?
Yeah, that would be the first thing they would do. They would probably appeal it. Well, yeah, if they lose it, there's a whole bunch of steps that take place afterwards, where the judge would call them in to talk over the damages and stuff, and then there would be the appeal process would start. So there's multiple steps, but the first thing the UFC would want to do is appeal that ruling.
Okay, so with an appeal, what happens then? It all goes back to trial again. How long would it take?
Well, there's a lot of possibilities there, and that's the thing. The appeal process, unlike the class cert, where there's a interlocutory appeal where they can just turn it down and nothing happens, right? It's over. We got to move on. There's some requirements in the next appeal process. So it would take, I remember talking to some people about this. We have all these, if they win the case in April, I guess, let's say May, there's a ruling. The rest of the year would be going through all the other steps. The appeal process would then probably get picked up by the 9th. There would be hearings on next year. Some briefings would be required. And then the 9th would make a ruling. And the ruling could be we turn down the appeal, or we think there's some merit to it. And then they could make a bunch of, we're going to have some hearings ourselves. We're going to send it back to Judge Boulware to redecide. So there's a bunch of possibilities. So we could have the 9th Circuit sometime early next year make their final ruling, or that could drag on for another year or so, right? And then after them, it goes to the Supreme Court. And if the 9th Circuit turns down or decides in favor of the defendants, not the defendants, but the plaintiffs, then the UFC has another thing they can do, is then they can go to appeal to a higher court, the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court at that point may turn it down. It would take several months, be a few months before they look it over, but they would decide if we're going to review it.
You are talking about the United States Supreme Court?
Yeah, the United States Supreme Court.
The ones that can be bought?
That's a possibility. So that's why I do think one thing going for the plaintiffs at this point, this is everybody listen now. Here's the thing. This is what's up. This is it gets a little complex, or it gets a little, where speculative on my part. But if the plaintiffs win a big winning and the damages are trebled, at that point, I could imagine the defendants UFC saying, we want to negotiate with you that price lower of the damages we lost. And what we're going to do is we will pay those damages, but now you don't have the crapshoot of having to get through the appeals court and the Supreme Court.
Oh,
you get money now. Gotcha. So I could see that happening, because also, as much as, the Supreme Court has some, Federalist Society people on it, it's hard for courts usually don't overturn jury decisions as much. They overturn rulings by the judges, not jury decisions. So it might be harder for the courts to look at it and say, there's something that we want to touch this case. So the UFC might be nervous at that point too. So at that point, after this trial is over, and the plaintiffs have won, that's where I could kind of see a settlement coming into play.
But either way, we are looking see, everyone keeps talking about, this April court date, and it's projected to only take about 4 weeks, and then bing, bang, boom, we're all done. That is not what's happening. Well,
it's not over, but it's the beginning of the end in some ways,
sure.
Because if the trial ends, then we know there's almost like we're going through the motions with the appeal process, and we know there's a date where this might possibly over through all the appeals and stuff. And so we can start and again, it gets scarier and scarier for the defendants if the plaintiffs won, to go to each appeal process and see if it gets knocked down or not.
Well, I would be fine if they weren't able to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. But if they get to go to the Supreme Court, where greased palms are a common thing over there, then I could see there possibly being some worry here for the plaintiffs, because the Supreme Court can be bought.
That is the fear a lot of people have, and people also. I think this might be an exaggeration, but people put a lot of thought in the idea into the idea that because Donald Trump is so in bed with the UFC and the ownership, and he's not completely, but he is, obviously there's a fondness between the two groups, and because he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, that they would rule in his favor. But not all the judges he's appointed have ruled consistently with what Donald Trump wanted. So
right, like Amy Coney Barrett, for instance.
Yeah,
she ruled against him on something or other. I read about it.
I think trying to decipher what the court would rule is pretty hard, and I can imagine it being a little nerve-wracking. And this works the opposite too. If the plaintiffs lose, they're going to appeal too.
Oh, I know. I figured that, but I was just thinking that, it's not going to be over after those 4 weeks, whether they win or lose. No matter who wins, no matter who loses, it's not going to be over for quite some time.
Yeah, unless barring a settlement somewhere along the lines, it's going to drag out for another. But I think the one thing is it's not going to drag out the number of years we've seen so far. I think we are now at the point where there is a timeline to finish this case.
Yeah,
we can say definitively, if this happens, it'll take this long. If this happens, it'll take this long. It'll take longer, but that'll be the end date. But we can kind of path a choose your own adventure based on the different possibilities. But each one has a set date that we can guess it's going to end at.
Well, fingers crossed it goes the way of the plaintiff. And that is going
to... Wait, what about those? What if I'm a shareholder in TKO? Then that's not what I want.
I don't care.
Okay.
How about that? There are no good shareholders.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a shareholder in TKO. So, but yeah, I know. I mean, listen, in many ways, and this is my ruling, you can have opinions on either way about the merits of the case, but I don't think it matters, because to me, it's obvious the UFC can afford it. And I would like to see fighters that I've talked to for years get more money.
Me too. Absolutely. I'm praying for that Johnson case to get the injunctive relief, because that's, I think, a bigger deal than all this money.
Yeah, no, that is definitely a bigger deal for the industry. It would be injunctive relief.
Yeah. for sure. So that is going to wrap us up for this week. And I know you guys have noticed that we have given you a show every week for the last 3 weeks, but you won't get one next week because John has family coming into town. So we won't be back for 2 weeks, just so you know. But we have given you lots of extra content. And what I want for you to do right now is, if you are not a subscriber, please subscribe now more than ever, because things are tight right now and media outlets are getting shut down left and right, and we are independent. So please help us out and subscribe. And do me another favor. Follow this guy on Twitter. He is, guess what? He's at Hey Not the Face. And if you would like to submit questions or suggestions or topics for us, his direct messages on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, are open. He is at Hey Not the Face. He also has an email account that is open for your questions, suggestions, topics, what have you. And that is heynottheface@gmail.com. My Twitter is also open for questions. I am Crooklyn MMA, and my email is also open. I'm crooklyn949@gmail.com. So from here, y'all already know the drill. Until next time, please stay safe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!